The Feast of Ashford was a day of celebration, a day when the small town came alive with music, food, and the joy of togetherness. It had been that way for as long as Joan could remember. Each year, her parents hosted the grandest of feasts in their home, inviting friends, family, and neighbors to celebrate the harvest and the blessings of the year. But that year was different. There was a guest, uninvited, who would change everything. And he would leave more than just memories. He would leave a mark, not just on Joan, but on her family's very souls. It started when Joan's parents welcomed the strange man into their home that evening. He appeared late, as if slipping through the shadows, his entrance barely noticed. He was tall, with a gaunt face hidden beneath the brim of a worn leather hat, his coat long and brown, tattered at the edges, as though it had lived through many seasons. Joan had asked her mother who he was, but her mother, busy with guests, dismissed her question with a soft, distracted smile. An old friend of a friend, dear, was all she said. Joan's unease deepened as the night wore on. The man didn't engage in conversation like the others. He didn't laugh, didn't join the toasts, and didn't dance. He merely stood in the corners of the room, eyes always watching, unblinking. Occasionally, he would step out into the garden, disappearing into the darkness, only to return a few moments later. But it wasn't just his odd behavior that unsettled Joan. It was the feeling that he was waiting. By midnight, the feast had quieted, the last of the guests trickling out into the night. But the man remained, standing by the fireplace, staring into the flickering flames. Joan noticed him one final time, standing there, his eyes fixed on her as if he had been waiting for her to notice him. Without a word, he walked toward the door, reaching up and placing a single dry leaf on the cabinet by the front door. Then he left. The leaf was brittle, brown, and curled at the edges, as though it had been plucked from the tree of some long-forgotten autumn. Joan touched it, but something about it made her skin crawl. She didn't know why, but she felt it had some deeper meaning, some connection to the man, to the strange presence that had watched over them all night. That night, when Joan went to bed, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The quiet hum of the house, the cool air from the open window, seemed to magnify the sense that something wasn't right. She tossed and turned in the dark, trying to push the unsettling feeling from her mind. But when sleep finally came, it brought something worse.
The first night after the feast, Joan awoke suddenly, her heart hammering in her chest. She had been dreaming of the man. In the dream, she was standing alone in a dark, fog-covered street. The air was thick, and every step she took felt like she was walking through molasses. The man appeared before her, his face still obscured by the shadow of his hat. His presence was suffocating, the very air around him still and cold. "Do you remember me?" His voice was low, rasping like the sound of dead leaves skittering across the ground. "I've been waiting for you." Joan couldn't move. Her limbs were frozen, as if bound by invisible chains. She wanted to scream, to ask what he meant, but her mouth wouldn't open. His gaze never left her face. "You will never forget me, Joan," he whispered, his breath cold against her ear. "Because I will never leave you." Suddenly, his face shifted, his skin pulled tight against the bones, his eyes hollow pits of blackness, and his lips stretched into a twisted grin that seemed to reach far beyond what a human face should be able to express. "You are mine now," he hissed. And then she woke up. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her sheets soaked in sweat. Joan lay still, staring at the ceiling, trying to steady her breath. She glanced toward the window, the moonlight spilling across the room, but the night felt too quiet. The shadows seemed longer, darker, like they were creeping in closer. She shivered. But the strangest part was that the dream hadn't been a one-time thing. Every night after the feast, the man returned in Joan's dreams. Each time, the details of the dream were exactly the same. The fog, the oppressive stillness of the street, his presence, looming and dark, always before her, always silent, except for his voice. And each time, the words were slightly different, but the meaning was the same. He was waiting, and each time, she would wake up in a cold sweat, feeling more drained, more terrified than before. After a few days, her parents noticed something was wrong. Joan was pale, exhausted, her eyes hollow from lack of sleep. She was hardly eating, barely speaking. When her mother asked what was going on, Joan could only say, "I'm fine." But the truth was, she couldn't escape him. Every night, the man's face haunted her dreams, and every night, his words echoed in her mind. "I will never leave you." Joan's parents thought little of it. They believed it was just stress, that the feast had overwhelmed her, and that she'd eventually recover. But then, one night, her father, tired from a long day of work, came to her room after hearing her restless tossing. "I couldn't sleep either," he said, sitting beside her on the bed. "Had a strange dream about that man." Joan froze, her blood running cold. "What do you mean?" "The man from the feast. He came to me in my dream, just like he did when I was a boy. Same man, same coat. He didn't say much, but it was like he was trying to warn me about something. That someone would die soon. Someone close." Joan's heart raced. "He came to you too?" she whispered, barely able to speak. Her father looked at her, puzzled by her reaction. "Yeah, but it's just a dream, Joan. You know how dreams are. They can be weird even if they don't make sense." But Joan's skin prickled as she heard those words. Someone close. She had dreamed the same thing. The man in the fog, waiting, saying cryptic things. And now her father had the same dream. He had seen the same face, heard the same words. That night, Joan's mother also had the dream. It was the same. The fog, the oppressive quiet, the man's voice whispering from the shadows. "You cannot escape what is already written," he had said to her. And just like the others, Joan's mother woke up feeling cold, unsettled, as though something terrible was coming.
The nights grew darker and darker, and the dreams became more vivid, more terrifying. Joan's family, once unaware of the man's presence, now found themselves unable to escape his grasp. And every night, the man appeared, always in their dreams, always the same. He never spoke of his intentions directly, but there was an unspoken message, an unsettling sense that something ominous was about to unfold. One night, Joan awoke to an even more terrifying sight than the dreams. The dry leaf that the man had placed on the cabinet was gone. She had not touched it, her parents hadn't, but somehow it had disappeared. The next morning, a cold dread settled in her chest. As she tried to push the thoughts from her mind, she received a call, news of a tragic accident in the town. A neighbor had died suddenly, struck by a car while walking along the road at night. The strange man's warning echoed in her mind, and she realized with horrifying clarity what was happening. Each time the man appeared in their dreams, someone close to them would die. But the worst part was yet to come. The final revelation. Joan couldn't sleep anymore, and the man appeared to her every night, his face twisting and shifting in the darkness. And one night, after weeks of torment, something changed in the dream. As Joan stood in the fog, the man stepped forward, his hands reaching out as if to touch her. "You're still here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You will never leave me," he replied, his voice colder than ever. "And neither will they." Suddenly, Joan understood the full extent of the man's power. He wasn't just a harbinger of death. He was a force, a shadow that clung to her family, and each year, on the night of the feast, he would appear again, pulling another soul into his grasp. The leaves were not just signs of his visit, they were a marker of someone's final days. His presence was a curse, and it would never break. The man smiled, and Joan's world fell away into the suffocating darkness. And from that night on, she knew that no matter how far she ran, no matter how many years passed, the man would always return. And with him, death would follow,